Hello and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we turn our attention to an object of quiet, unassuming utility. An item so commonplace in the modern kitchen, it is often handled and discarded without a second thought. I'm speaking of the humble egg carton. It rests in our refrigerators, a silent guardian, its sole purpose to protect its fragile contents on their journey from the farm to the breakfast table. But if you look closely at its design, at the precise geometry of its individual cells, you will see a story of subtle innovation. Each conical post, each scalloped hollow, and each locking tab is the result of decades of problem-solving. It is a miniature architecture of protection, refined over time by engineers and inventors you have almost certainly never heard of. But how did this seemingly mundane object evolve? To truly understand its quiet significance, we must gently peel back the layers of its history and examine its origins in a time when getting a dozen eggs home was a far more precarious affair. To begin our journey, we must first travel back to a world before the specialized container we know today, to the late 19th and very early 20th centuries. In this period, the journey of an egg was fraught with peril. The path from the rural henhouse to the urban consumer was a long and often bumpy one, and the egg, by its very nature, is a marvel of structural integrity and profound fragility all at once. For the small farmer, eggs were a vital source of consistent income, a product harvested daily. These eggs were typically collected in simple wicker baskets or metal pails, often cushioned with a generous lining of straw, hay, or even sawdust. This was the first line of defense, a loose, organic padding that relied on volume and softness to absorb the minor shocks of being carried from the coop to the farmhouse. For local distribution, perhaps to a nearby general store or a neighbor, this method was often sufficient. But the real challenge arose in transporting these eggs to the burgeoning cities. The growth of urban centers, fueled by industrialization, created a massive, consolidated demand for farm products. To meet this demand, eggs had to be consolidated at collection points, packed for bulk transport, and shipped via horse-drawn wagon and, increasingly, by rail. The standard shipping container of the era was the wooden crate. A typical egg crate was a large, rectangular box, often made of rough-hewn pine or other inexpensive lumber, designed to hold several dozen or even several hundred eggs. Inside these crates, the challenge of protecting each individual egg became a complex logistical puzzle. The most common solution was a system of cardboard dividers, known as fillers and flats. Imagine a grid. The fillers were interlocking strips of cardboard that formed a series of square cells, not unlike the dividers in a modern case of wine. A flat, which was simply a flat sheet of cardboard, would be placed at the bottom of the crate. A filler grid would be placed on top of it, and an egg would be carefully placed, point down, into each cell. Then another flat would be placed on top of the eggs, followed by another filler, and another layer of eggs. This process was repeated, creating a densely packed stack of eggs, separated horizontally and vertically by cardboard. While this system was a significant improvement over loose packing in straw, it was far from perfect. The cardboard itself offered minimal cushioning. The primary method of protection was separation. The fillers prevented eggs from knocking directly against one another. However, the system was highly susceptible to shock and vibration. A sudden jolt on a rough road or the shunting of a rail car could easily transfer a shockwave through the entire rigid structure, causing cracks to cascade through multiple layers. The top and bottom layers of eggs in a crate were particularly vulnerable. Breakage rates were consistently high, often ranging from 5 to 10%, and sometimes much higher on particularly difficult journeys. A broken egg was not just a loss in itself. The leaking contents could soil adjacent eggs, rendering them unsalable and promoting bacterial growth, which could spoil an entire section of the crate. The economic implications of this breakage were significant. It was a built-in cost of business for egg merchants, a loss that had to be factored into the final price paid by the consumer. For the grocer at the end of the line, opening a crate of eggs was an uncertain process. They would have to carefully unpack the layers, inspecting for damage and sorting the salable eggs from the leakers and checks, a term for eggs with hairline cracks. Once in the store, the challenge was not over. The grocer would then sell the eggs to customers by the dozen or half dozen, counting them out from the crate and placing them into a simple paper bag. The final, most delicate leg of the journey, from the store to the home, was now the customer's responsibility. It was a common and frustrating experience for a homemaker to arrive home, unpack their groceries, and find that one or more of their carefully selected eggs had cracked against a tin of beans or a bag of potatoes. This was the world that awaited the invention of the egg carton, a world crying out for a better way to cradle and protect one of nature's most essential foods. The first glimmers of a solution, a dedicated consumer-level package, began to appear around the turn of the 20th century. These early efforts were varied and often cumbersome, but they all shared a common goal: to isolate and cushion each individual egg. One of the earliest notable attempts came not from America, but from England. In 1906, an inventor named Thomas Peter Bethel patented what he called the Raylight egg box. It was a simple but clever design, consisting of a cardboard box containing a set of interlocking cardboard strips, much like the large fillers used in shipping crates, but on a smaller scale. These strips created a grid of 12 cells. The innovation here was to bring the crate filler concept down to a consumer-friendly size. While it provided good separation, it still suffered from the same lack of individual cushioning as its larger counterparts. It was rigid, and shocks could still be transferred through the cardboard frame. The true breakthrough, the invention that would set the stage for the next century of egg protection, came from a newspaper editor in British Columbia, Canada. In 1911, a man named Joseph Coyle was the publisher of the Omanica Herald in the small town of Aldermere. As the local story goes, a dispute between a hotel owner and a farmer over habitually broken eggs sparked an idea in Coyle's mind. The hotelier was frustrated with the inconsistent quality of the egg deliveries, and Coyle, a man of an inventive bent, decided to devise a solution. He began experimenting with paper, a material he knew intimately from his newspaper business. His creation, which he patented in 1918, was the Coyle Safety Egg Carton. It was a work of simple genius. It was formed from a single sheet of heavy paper or newsprint. Through a series of clever cuts and folds, the paper was formed into a structure with 2 rows of 6 cells. The crucial innovation was the shape of these cells. Unlike the square cells of the Bethel box or the shipping fillers, Coyle's design featured cushioned posts that rose up from the bottom of the carton. Each egg would rest in a pocket, suspended between these resilient, shock-absorbing paper supports. The egg was held securely, its weight distributed, and it was protected from both vertical and horizontal impacts. The entire carton could be folded flat for shipping and then easily assembled by the grocer or farmer. Coyle established the Coyle Safety Carton Company and began manufacturing his invention. It was a significant step forward, offering a level of protection that was previously unattainable in a small package. However, the process was still rooted in cutting and folding, a somewhat labor-intensive method. The next great leap would require a whole new way of thinking about the material itself. This next phase in our story belongs to the Keyes Fiber Company of Waterville, Maine. Martin Keyes, the company's founder, had already made a name for himself by inventing a machine that could produce disposable paper plates from wood pulp. In the 1920s, the company turned its attention to the problem of egg packaging. They were pioneers in the field of molded pulp, a technology that would come to define the egg carton for generations. The process was fundamentally different from Coyle's folded paper design. Instead of starting with a flat sheet of paper, the molded pulp process began with a slurry. To understand the molded pulp carton, one must first understand how it is made. The process begins with raw material, which was, and still is, primarily recycled paper. Newsprint, cardboard, and other paper waste are mixed with water in a large vat and agitated vigorously to create a thick, oatmeal-like suspension called a slurry. The paper fibers are broken down and evenly distributed throughout the water. This slurry is the lifeblood of the process. From this vat, the slurry is pumped to the forming machine. The heart of this machine is the mold. The mold is a screen, precisely shaped into the negative form of the final egg carton, a collection of hollows and posts. This mold is submerged into the slurry, and a powerful vacuum is applied from behind the screen. The vacuum sucks the water through the fine mesh of the screen, leaving the paper fibers deposited in a uniform layer on the surface of the mold. The longer the mold is submerged and the stronger the vacuum, the thicker the wall of the resulting carton will be. After a few seconds, the mold is lifted from the slurry, now coated in a wet, fragile layer of paper fibers. This wet, preform is then transferred, often by another mold using a reverse vacuum or a puff of air, onto a drying conveyor. The cartons then travel through a long, heated oven, where the remaining water is slowly evaporated, leaving a rigid, lightweight, and surprisingly strong final product. This technology was revolutionary. It allowed for the creation of complex, three-dimensional shapes in a single, efficient process. For egg cartons, it was a perfect match. The Keyes Fiber Company used this process to create a carton that became the archetype for what we know today. It was the familiar 2x6 configuration, holding a dozen eggs. This format, 2 rows of 6, was not arbitrary. It provided an excellent balance of stability, efficient use of material, and a convenient shape for both stacking on shelves and fitting into home iceboxes and, later, refrigerators. The key design element of these early molded pulp cartons was the conical post that rose from the bottom of the carton, situated between the pockets where the eggs would rest. This was an evolution of coil's cushioned supports, but rendered in a more robust, three-dimensional form. The geometry was critical. When the carton was closed, these posts would fit between the eggs in the top half of the carton, preventing them from shifting or colliding. The posts also provided immense structural strength, particularly against vertical compression. This meant that the cartons could be stacked high in shipping cases without the weight crushing the cartons at the bottom. The cell itself, the pocket where the eggs sat, was also carefully designed. It was a smooth, rounded cup, shaped to cradle the bottom of the egg, distributing its weight evenly and minimizing pressure points. The molded pulp material itself had an inherent softness and resilience that paperboard lacked, providing a natural cushioning effect that absorbed small vibrations and shocks. The material specifications of these early pulp cartons were a matter of continuous refinement. The choice of recycled paper was not just about cost. Different types of paper had different fiber lengths. Longer fibers, like those from cardboard, provided more strength, while shorter fibers, from newsprint, created a smoother finish. Manufacturers learned to blend these materials to achieve the desired balance of strength, stiffness, and cushioning. The thickness of the carton walls was another critical variable, controlled by the slurry consistency and the vacuum forming time. A thicker wall meant more strength and protection, but also used more material and cost more to produce. The industry began to develop standards for compression strength, testing how much weight a carton could support before deforming, ensuring they could withstand the rigors of the increasingly sophisticated American logistics network. As we move into the 1930s and 1940s, the molded pulp egg carton became the dominant force in the market. Its superiority in protecting eggs was undeniable, and the efficiency of its production made it economically viable. Companies like Keyes Fiber and, later, the Diamond Gardner Corporation refined the manufacturing process, making it faster and more consistent. The design of the carton itself underwent subtle but important changes. The shape of the central posts was tweaked, sometimes becoming more pyramidal, sometimes more rounded, as engineers experimented with what shapes offered the best structural support and shock distribution. The locking mechanism was another area of focus. Early cartons were often held shut by a simple friction fit or a single tab that tucked into a slot. Over time, more secure closures were developed. One common design was a pair of tabs on the front flap that would press through slots on the main body. Once through, small button-like protrusions on the tabs would lock into place, requiring a deliberate press to open. This prevented cartons from accidentally popping open during transport or when being handled by customers in a store. The details were small, but they contributed to a more reliable and user-friendly package. The end of the Second World War ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity and technological change in the United States, and these changes had a profound impact on the American grocery store. The rise of the self-service supermarket in the 1950s was a particularly transformative development. Before this, a customer would approach a counter and ask a clerk for the items they wanted. The clerk would retrieve the goods from shelves behind the counter. But in the new supermarket model, customers roamed the aisles themselves, selecting products directly from the shelves. This shift had enormous consequences for packaging. A product no longer had to be merely functional. It had to sell itself. It had to be its own advertisement, catching the shopper's eye and communicating quality and value. For the egg carton, this meant a transition from a purely utilitarian object to a piece of branded marketing. The rough, greyish-brown surface of the natural molded pulp carton began to give way to new possibilities. Manufacturers began adding dyes to the pulp slurry, producing cartons in a range of soft pastel colors. Pale green, light blue, and pink became common. These colors were chosen to evoke feelings of freshness, nature, and cleanliness. A green carton might subtly suggest a pastoral, farm-fresh origin for the eggs within. This was the beginning of using the carton's appearance to influence consumer perception. Printing technology also evolved. Early cartons were often stamped with the producer's name in a single color of ink. But as the supermarket age dawned, more sophisticated printing techniques were developed. It was now possible to print multicolor logos, farm scenes, and brand names directly onto the surface of the carton. This presented a challenge, as the textured, porous surface of molded pulp was not ideal for sharp, detailed printing. However, specialized inks and printing presses were developed to handle the job, and the egg carton became a small billboard in the dairy aisle. The space on the top of the carton was prime real iron, and designers carefully arranged branding, egg size information, and quality grades to be as clear and appealing as possible. Alongside these aesthetic developments, the functional design of the carton continued its slow and steady evolution. The Diamond Gardner Corporation, which would later become Diamond International, became a major innovator in this period. They introduced what was known as the cell post design. This was a refinement of the classic molded pulp structure. Instead of a single, solid post between the eggs, their designs often featured hollow posts or posts with unique shapes, designed to flex and absorb impact more effectively. The idea was to create more airspace and cushioning around each egg, further isolating it from external forces. Engineers studied the physics of shock absorption, analyzing how forces traveled through the pulp material and designing cell structures that would dissipate that energy before it could reach the eggshell. Another significant innovation of the post-war era was the introduction of the windowed carton. Grocers and consumers had always shared a common frustration: the inability to see if any eggs were broken without opening the carton. To address this, manufacturers began to use die-cutting machines to create small openings, or peepholes, in the top of the carton. These windows, often oval or rectangular in shape, allowed a customer to peer inside and inspect the eggs for cracks. This was a major step forward in consumer convenience and confidence. However, it also presented an engineering challenge. Cutting holes in the top of the carton inherently weakened its structure. The design had to be modified to compensate for this loss of material. The areas around the windows were often reinforced with raised ribs or thicker pulp to maintain the necessary compression strength for stacking. Some designs even covered these windows with a thin film of cellophane to keep out dust while maintaining visibility. Though this added an extra step and cost to the manufacturing process, the material specifications of molded pulp were also becoming more sophisticated. As supply chains grew longer and eggs were kept in refrigerated storage for longer periods, the issue of moisture became more critical. Molded pulp is, at its core, paper, and it can absorb moisture from the atmosphere. A damp carton would lose its rigidity, becoming soft and weak, compromising its ability to protect the eggs. To combat this, manufacturers began to experiment with sizing agents. Sizing is a process where chemicals are added to the pulp slurry that make the final paper product more resistant to water absorption. Various starches and rosins were used to coat the paper fibers, preventing them from wicking up moisture from condensation in a cold, humid environment like a refrigerated truck or a supermarket dairy case. These subtle chemical additions were invisible to the consumer, but they were vital to ensuring the carton performed its duty reliably from the packing station to the home kitchen. The late 1960s and 1970s brought a new wave of change, this time driven by the plastics industry. The post-war boom in chemical engineering had produced a vast array of new polymers with remarkable properties, and packaging designers were eager to put them to use. For the egg carton, two new materials would emerge as challenges to the long-standing dominance of molded pulp: expanded polystyrene foam and clear thermoplastic. Expanded polystyrene, commonly known by the Dow Chemical Company's trade name, Styrofoam, was the first to make a significant impact. The manufacturing process for a foam carton was entirely different from that of molded pulp. It starts with small solid beads of polystyrene resin. These beads are impregnated with a blowing agent, a chemical that expands into a gas when heated. In a first step, called pre-expansion, the beads are heated with steam, causing them to expand to many times their original size, becoming lightweight, hollow spheres. These pre-expanded beads are then allowed to cool and stabilize before being conveyed to the final mold. The mold, shaped like the desired egg carton, is filled with the beads. More steam is then injected into the mold, causing the beads to expand further, fusing together and filling every crevice of the mold to form a solid, lightweight, and rigid carton. Foam cartons offered several advantages that appealed to egg producers and retailers. First, they were exceptionally lightweight, which could lead to minor savings in shipping costs. Second, they were virtually waterproof. Unlike molded pulp, foam did not absorb moisture and lose its strength in damp conditions. This was a major selling point for producers concerned with maintaining package integrity in refrigerated supply chains. Third, the material had excellent insulating properties, which was thought to help keep the eggs at a more stable temperature. Finally, the smooth, non-porous surface of the foam was an excellent canvas for printing. It allowed for much brighter, sharper, and more detailed graphics than could ever be achieved on molded pulp, giving brands a new way to stand out on the shelf. The design of foam cartons also differed from their pulp counterparts. The molding process allowed for very precise and uniform cell shapes. The locking mechanisms were often more integrated into the design, with a satisfying and secure snap closure that consumers found reassuring. However, foam cartons were not without their drawbacks. While they were strong, they were also more brittle than pulp cartons. A sharp impact might crack the foam, whereas a pulp carton might dent or deform, still providing some measure of protection. There was also the question of breathability. Paper pulp is porous, allowing for some air and moisture exchange, which some experts believed was beneficial for the eggs. The impermeable nature of foam did not allow for this. And, as the environmental movement gained traction in the later decades of the 20th century, the non-biodegradable nature of polystyrene would become a significant point of contention. Following on the heels of foam came the clear plastic carton, typically made from polyethylene terephthalate, or PET. This innovation offered the ultimate solution to the age-old problem of inspecting eggs. With a completely transparent carton, the consumer could see every single egg at a glance, without even needing to touch the package. The manufacturing process for these cartons is called thermoforming. It begins with a thin, flat sheet of clear plastic. This sheet is heated until it becomes soft and pliable. It is then draped over a mold, and a vacuum is used to pull the sheet down tightly against the mold surface, forcing it into the desired egg carton shape. Once cooled, the plastic becomes rigid again, and the formed carton is trimmed from the sheet. The design of clear plastic cartons presented a unique set of engineering challenges. The plastic sheet is very thin, so creating a strong, rigid structure requires clever geometric reinforcement. Designers incorporated a series of ribs, indentations, and carefully angled surfaces to give the carton the necessary strength to protect the eggs and withstand stacking. The hinge of a clear plastic carton is often a living hinge, a thin section of plastic that is designed to be flexed repeatedly without breaking. The snap closure mechanism had to be designed with great precision to be both secure and easy for the consumer to open and close. These cartons were often perceived as a premium option, showcasing the perfect, unblemished eggs within. they communicated a sense of modern, clean, and high-quality product. So by the 1980s, the American grocery store aisle featured a diverse ecosystem of egg cartons. The traditional reliable molded pulp carton, now available in various colors, coexisted with the lightweight, brightly printed foam carton and the modern, transparent plastic carton. The choice of which carton to use often came down to the egg producer's branding strategy, cost considerations, and the capabilities of their packing equipment. Some producers might use pulp for their standard eggs, foam for their budget line, and clear plastic for their premium organic or free-range offerings. The market had segmented, and the carton was now a key part of how those segments were defined. Throughout this entire period, from the 1920s to the 1990s, another, more subtle evolutionary pressure was at work: standardization. As the American food system became more integrated and national in scope, the need for uniform standards in packaging became paramount. This was driven by both government regulation and the practical demands of logistics. A key factor was the standardization of egg sizes by the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA. Eggs were graded for quality, AA, A, or B, and sorted by size, based on their weight per dozen. The familiar categories of jumbo, extra large, large, medium, small, and peewee each correspond to a specific minimum weight. This standardization of the product inside the carton had a direct impact on the design of the cell. A carton designed for medium eggs would be too small for jumbo eggs, which could crack under the pressure of the lid closing. Conversely, a medium egg would rattle around loosely in a carton designed for jumbo eggs, increasing the risk of breakage from movement. Carton manufacturers, therefore, had to produce different versions of their designs, each optimized for a specific size range. The diameter of the cell, the height of the posts, and the overall clearance inside the carton had to be precisely calibrated. A well-designed cell would hold the egg snugly but gently, making contact only at the strongest points of the shell, typically around its wider circumference, while leaving a small air gap at the top and bottom. The logistics of moving millions of cartons of eggs across the country also drove standardization. The outer dimensions of the egg carton became critically important. Cartons needed to fit neatly and efficiently into standard shipping cases, which in turn needed to stack perfectly onto standard-sized pallets for transport by truck and train. A carton that was just a quarter of an inch too wide could mean that one less case would fit on a pallet, a seemingly small difference that, when multiplied by thousands of shipments, would result in significant wasted space and increased transportation costs. Carton designers had to work within a strict set of dimensional constraints, ensuring their product integrated seamlessly into this vast and complex system. Compression strength, which had always been an important consideration, became a quantifiable and standardized metric. Egg producers needed to know exactly how many cases of their eggs could be safely stacked in a warehouse or on a truck. Carton manufacturers would perform rigorous testing using specialized equipment to apply measured force to their cartons and determine their failure point. This data allowed them to guarantee a certain level of performance, which was essential for their customers in the large-scale food industry. Even the most minute details of the cell design continued to be refined. Engineers looked for every possible way to improve cushioning and reduce shock transfer. Some designs incorporated tiny raised dimples or subtle ribs on the inner surface of the cell walls. These features were designed to create additional air pockets and reduce the surface area of contact between the egg and the carton, further dampening vibrations. The exact angle of the conical posts was a subject of endless analysis. A steeper angle might provide better separation, while a shallower, broader angle might offer better support against vertical forces. The interplay between the pocket that held the bottom of the egg and the posts that separated the tops was a delicate balancing act. The goal was to create a suspension system for each egg, a protective cocoon that could absorb and dissipate energy from any direction. The airflow within the carton was another consideration. Proper refrigeration is key to egg freshness, and the design of the carton could affect how efficiently cold air circulated around the eggs. While this was a more significant factor for molded pulp cartons due to their porous nature, Even the design of plastic and foam cartons could influence cooling rates. Some designs incorporated small vents or channels intended to promote air circulation when the cartons were stacked together in a case. As the period drew to a close in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the egg carton had become a highly engineered object, a far cry from Joseph Coyle's folded paper invention. It was a product shaped by a confluence of forces: the physics of shock absorption, the chemistry of paper and plastics, the economics of mass production, the psychology of consumer marketing, and the rigid demands of a national logistics network. The cell design had evolved from a simple square compartment to a sophisticated cradle, optimized for a specific egg size. The materials had diversified from plain newsprint to colored and water-resistant pulp, lightweight foam, and transparent plastic. The evolution of the egg carton is a story without grand pronouncements or dramatic turning points. It is a quiet story, told in the language of patent diagrams, material specifications, and subtle shifts in geometry. It reflects the broader narrative of 20th century America, a story of increasing industrial efficiency, the rise of consumer culture, and the creation of the complex systems that bring food to our tables. The next time you open your refrigerator and reach for an egg, take a moment to look at the container in your hand. It is more than just a piece of disposable packaging. It is a small, silent testament to decades of careful thought and gradual improvement, an architecture of everyday life, perfected in its mundane utility. It is a piece of boring history that every day performs its simple, vital task, so reliably that we have the luxury of never having to think about it at all. And now, with the journey of the egg carton mapped out, from the bumpy wagon roads of the past to the climate-controlled supermarkets of the present, perhaps you can allow your own mind to rest, to settle into the quiet, protected space that precedes a peaceful sleep. The details have been attended to, the story is complete, all that is left is to drift away.